As Jesus of Nazareth said, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. So, you want to be rich? Are you sure? Throughout history, men and women have ignored JC's warning and instead dedicated themselves to raking in as much cash as possible. Old money, new money, blood money, even other people's money. And some have gone so far as to work for it. The path you choose is, of course, up to you. But you might be happier if you make the best of what you have. Oh, all right then, if you insist. Here's what history has to say about how you could make a fortune. There's an awful lot of history in the world. Too much, really. So let's skip all the boring stuff and get straight to the interesting bits. Sit back while we bring you the surprising, funny, frightening, and sometimes downright odd true stories about what people in the past were getting up to and how to make it all work for you. This is History. The interesting bits. Surely the easiest way to make a fortune is to be related to one. There's nothing like being a member of an obscenely rich dynasty to give you a little leg up in the world. Generations of accumulated wealth dropping into your lap is awfully nice to have. But even that has to start somewhere. Hugh Lupus's family were among William the Conqueror's right-hand men when he subjugated England in 1066. As a reward, Hugh got land, titles, and the somewhat unflattering nickname of Le Gros Veneur, or the Fat Hunter. Your average Briton's French, being what it was, Le Gros Veneur, eventually became Grosvenor. And his descendants soon found that once you're in the wealthy club, the world offers endless opportunities to increase your fortunes. In 1677, Sir Thomas Grosvenor married Mary Davies. He was 21, she was, 12. This sounds disturbing, and is, though disturbing does not mean unusual in 17th century England. Mary had inherited around 500 acres of soggy land to the west of London, usually described as swampy meadows. But land is land, however waterlogged, and Thomas kept it for a rainy day. In 1720, London was booming, and people were flocking to what was rapidly becoming the fastest growing city on earth. Thomas's descendants started to drain and develop their bog. Yesterday's swampy meadow became today's Mayfair, Park Lane, and Belgravia, the most affluent addresses in London. And to cap it all, in the 19th century, Hugh Lupus Grosvenor was dubbed the first Duke of Westminster. The Grosvenors have remained very protective of their swamp, and the story goes that when, in the 1940s, America tried to acquire title to the land on which the US Embassy stood, another of Sir Thomas's descendants, the second Duke of Westminster, refused to sell. Unless, that is, the US handed back prime Florida real estate the family had lost in the War of Independence. The US politely declined, and ultimately moved from Mayfair to a less fashionable spot in South London, in what President Donald Trump derided as a bad deal. In fact, for most of human history, real estate has always been what real estates are built from. Old money liked to show off how much land it controlled, and keep its vulgar business dealings under wraps. Not that the aristocracy wouldn't open its doors to people who got staggeringly rich the hard way. Like German banker Jakob Fugger. Fugger created the world's first news service. He used his inside track to be ahead of events in making financial decisions. Just like a modern hedge fund analyst. Known in his lifetime as Fugger the Rich, Jakob was the man popes and kings came to when they needed cash. Not surprising, as his fortune was equivalent to 1% of the entire gross domestic product of Europe. But he was also a forerunner of the modern rich philanthropist. In 1516, he created the world's first affordable housing project, a walled town within his home city of Augsburg in southern Germany, where workers could live debt-free for a fraction of the normal cost. Remarkably, it's still there today, operating as public housing for local residents 500 years later. Fugger's wealth saw his family accepted into Germany's titled nobility. But 300 years later, another banking family went one better. Meyer Amschel Rothschild was a legend in the 18th century banking world and personal banker to German royalty. His greatest investment, however, was his 5 sons, who he raised to take over the business. This was in an age of wars and revolutions, when moving gold and silver around the continent left it prey to every highwayman, pirate, and warring army that stumbled across it. So, each of the Rothschild sons, known as the 5 Arrows, set up a bank in a different European capital. Being brothers, they could trust each other. So rather than ship gold between cities, they left the loot where it was and just sent credit notes to each other. This international network was a whole new and much safer way of banking, but a terrible disappointment for highwaymen everywhere. The Rothschilds bankrolled the British government during the Napoleonic Wars and used their international network to deliver hard cash to the Duke of Wellington, wherever it was needed on his campaigns, in the right local currency. Their network of couriers was so good, Nathan Rothschild in London got news of Wellington's victory over Napoleon at Waterloo a full day before the British government was informed. Their banking institutions and capital were behind nation and empire building, industrialization and globalization right through the 19th century. So, not surprisingly, they were welcomed into the ranks of Europe's titled aristocracy, as it was whispered that they were the wealthiest family in the world. With roots across the continent, they created dynasties that have lasted into the 21st century. If you've not had the good fortune to be born into a rich and powerful dynasty, maybe you can get one to take you in. Sometimes, though, getting accepted into the right family can pay off big time. One way, of course, is by marriage. In 7th century China, Wu Zetian tied the knot and became the most powerful woman in the world. She was once a favorite concubine of the Emperor Taizong, but when he died, she moved on to marry his son and heir, the new emperor, Gaozong. When Gaozong also died, Wu went for the top job herself, first ruling as a dowager empress through her youngest son, and then by becoming the monarch herself, the only female emperor in Chinese history. Under her stewardship, the empire expanded far beyond its previous borders and massively increased trade along the Silk Road. Historians have estimated that her empire controlled the equivalent of 22.7% of global GDP, an eye-boggling $18 trillion, roughly half America's current national debt. But there is a catch with marrying into wealth. When Wu Zetian died, the throne and the cash went to her late husband's relations, not hers. Being adopted into the right family can be extraordinarily lucrative. Rome's first emperor, Augustus, got his start by being the adopted son and sole heir to his uncle, Julius Caesar. This massive inheritance was just the leg up he needed to make himself emperor. And by the time he died, Augustus's personal net worth had ballooned, at least in part, because the most valuable bit of the Roman Empire, Egypt, was now part of his personal domain. So rich did he become that he managed to give away the equivalent of over $2 billion and spent about another $1.5 billion buying up prime real estate in Italy and beyond. Augustus's net worth would put today's oligarchs in the shade. Whoever Augustus passed his vast estate on to when he died got to be not only super rich, but also Emperor of Rome. At least until the supply of heirs ran out some 54 years later, when Nero killed himself and put an end to Augustus's line. Incompetent or ungrateful offspring have long been the scourge of the ultra-rich. Just ask George Hearst. George was from poor farming stock, rough, dishevelled, and almost illiterate. He was also one of the finest business brains in American history, developing giant gold, silver, and copper mines that made him millions. Oh, and he became a United States Senator to boot. So George was well placed to give his son William opportunities he himself could only have dreamt of, and the ungrateful brat promptly set about squandering them. William got thrown out of Harvard after having chamber pots engraved with the faces of his distinguished professors delivered to their homes. Undeterred, George decided to introduce William to the family mining business. But, surprise, surprise, Daddy's boy had other ideas.
When you make a lot of money, you tend to think that you've done your progeny a favor. You've made them rich. Doesn't mean that the children must follow suit. Some do, some don't. In the case of Hearst, he had his own vision separate from his father.
With his son unwilling to join the mining business, George Hearst handed William a failing newspaper he'd reportedly won in a poker game. The San Francisco Examiner. And that's where William found his feet. Hearst Jr. had fallen in love with publishing during his stint on the Harvard Lampoon. He wasn't afraid of hard work, and he had a nose for a story. Within 2 years, he'd hugely increased the Examiner's circulation, and soon the money was pouring in. William was on his way to becoming one of the richest people in the world and making the Hearst name synonymous with fantastic wealth. But let's face it, most of us are not going to be given a newspaper to play with by a rich parent. So if we want to get rich, we're going to have to start from scratch. The richest people in the modern age didn't inherit their fortune. They earned it through hard work, ingenuity, a dash of ruthlessness, and a lot of luck.
In order to be a successful tycoon, you must have a vision that you are passionate about. Once you realize that vision, you must be ruthless in implementing it. And you must be a workaholic.
In 19th century America, George Hearst was pushing his way into the ranks of a gaggle of new tycoons who were seizing the opportunity to exploit the vast continent's natural resources. Of these self-made tycoons, one of the richest was John D. Rockefeller. His oil empire began with a modest start. He reportedly set out with ambitions to earn $100,000 and live 100 years. He far exceeded the first of those and almost managed the second. His formal business training amounted to a 10-week class in accounting and a few off-the-record lessons from his snake oil salesman father. But armed with only that, he went from selling perishable goods to creating a monopoly that at its height controlled 90% of the crude oil refining business in the United States.
Americans now travel with efficient economical power, while the complex machinery that carries them is protected and lubricated with oil.
And Rockefeller was the embodiment of the ruthless tycoon. He may have treated his senior managers with kindness and recognized their contribution, but he aggressively opposed unionization and did everything to destroy his rivals, making secret deals with the railroads and buying up barrels and even the raw materials to make them to be sure his oil arrived first. Rockefeller had another quality you need to make a fortune. He was a workaholic. So much so that he drove himself to complete nervous collapse by 50 and lost all his body hair as a result. All that work saw his fortune grow to what today would be around $340 billion. Many of these new American tycoons would strike it rich in one business, but then diversify to build an empire.
Typically, people who build wealth have to diversify to make sure it will last generations. That's why you move into other industries, so that your portfolio is not subject to the ups and downs of one industry. You have the Astors, who started out in fur and then moved into real estate. You have the Vanderbilts, who started out with steamboats and then moved into railroads. You have the Rockefellers, oil, Standard Oil, and then they diversified into other holdings.
To make a fortune without coming from one, like Rockefeller or Hearst Sr., hard work and ruthlessness may well be essential, but so is the ability to spot that opportunity and seize it. A gift A.G. Gaston certainly had. The grandchild of formerly enslaved people, Gaston started by charging the other kids in his neighborhood to ride on the swing in his yard. When he got a job in a mining outfit, he saw the next big thing wasn't digging coal, but selling lunches to other miners. With the money he made, he went into the loan business.
A.G. Gaston is a legendary figure in African American culture and in American history. He built his fortune in Birmingham, Alabama during segregation and the worst part of Jim Crow in America.
In the segregated society of the South, Black Americans' ability to control their finances was severely restricted. Gaston realized that the widows of African American miners couldn't arrange insurance to finance their husbands' funerals. So he set up a local burial society, where paying 25 cents a week secured a decent burial. He also created a wider insurance company to offer life, health, and accident insurance.
A.G. Gaston saw a need within the Black community, and he decided that he could fill it. He built a penny savings bank to allow people to put money away for savings. He built an insurance company. He built a funeral home. Basically, it was almost like cradle to grave.
Gaston then opened a hotel business in Birmingham, serving Black Americans. In the early days of the civil rights movement, he was criticized for keeping out of the political struggle, until he saw a child propelled down the street outside his office by a police water cannon. After that, he threw his considerable weight behind the movement, providing financial help and accommodation to civil rights leaders, including Dr. Martin Luther King.
His motel in Birmingham became one of the key focal points. Specifically, room 30 at the motel was known as the War Room. It's where Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, Martin Luther King, and others involved in that movement would meet and plan the strategies. The motel was bombed because of the people meeting there. But A.G. Gaston continued to let the civil rights leaders use that room because he knew that things had to change, that segregation and Jim Crow had to come to an end.
When he died in 1996, his net worth was estimated to be just under $233 million in modern terms. If you have a nose for opportunity, there are fortunes to be made by sheer creativity. Like Gaston, Gabrielle Chanel, born in 1883, also started in childhood poverty. When she was 12, her mother died, and her father abandoned her to an orphanage and a strict convent upbringing. Not taking to nuns, she became a stage singer and acquired her nickname Coco from cocotte, the French slang for a kept woman. In 1910, aged 27, she opened her first millinery store in Paris. 2 more followed, and the rest is fashion history. In 1824, when Charles Dickens was 12 years old, his father was locked in a debtor's prison. So Dickens had to work 10-hour days in a boot polish factory, earning what would now be around $30 a week. But Charles put the experience to good use, basing some of the most famous characters in literary history on the people he met during his deprived upbringing. By the age of 24, his hit debut novel, The Pickwick Papers, was published in monthly installments, setting him on the road to riches and fame.
Creative people have several ways to build wealth over time. One way is the stream of royalty payments from your work, as well as retaining ownership in your work. Think of the Dickens estate. He has been dead for years, but the books continue to sell and get published every year.
When Dickens died, his estate was worth around $8 million in modern terms. More than 150 years later, his yearly book sales continue to leave many contemporary novelists in the shade. Add in the tourism opportunities and money generated by film and TV adaptations, and Charles Dickens is still contributing millions to the UK economy every year. All of which brings us back to William Randolph Hearst, who bought another struggling newspaper, the populist New York Journal. The Journal was the weapon he intended to use to take on rival newspaper, the New York World, run by the legendary Joseph Pulitzer. And soon they were caught in a circulation war. For years, Hearst and Pulitzer chased each other down market in the pursuit of readers, with sensational stories about sex, crime, and graphic horrors. Where once their headlines read, "Man killed in Queens," they now shouted, "Screaming for mercy!" This tabloid style became known as yellow journalism, when Hearst stole Pulitzer's popular cartoon character, the Yellow Kid. But Pulitzer wasn't beaten. He just hired another artist to keep drawing the Yellow Kid in his paper. And the fight went on. Their audience-grabbing techniques are still familiar today. Brash layouts, big illustrations, and plenty of unnamed sources. But by the early 1900s, Pulitzer conceded defeat and returned his paper to its original crusading roots as an atonement for what he called his yellow sins. He couldn't beat Hearst, and he certainly wasn't going to join him. So to give his reputation a little polish, he set up the most famous prize in journalism, which still bears his name today. Meanwhile, Hearst built the biggest media conglomerate in the world, with newspapers, magazines, and radio, and was soon to set his sights even higher. But if the idea of becoming a press baron, oil tycoon, or internationally best-selling author sounds just too much like hard work, there is an easier way to make a fortune, provided you're happy to play dirty. There are plenty of quick and easy ways to make money, provided you don't think overly hard about where the money comes from or who might get hurt along the way. And there's no business in history that's done more to give making money a bad name than the slave trading business. While the institution of slavery has been around for almost all of human history, the combination of colonialism, capitalism, and globalization in the 17th and 18th centuries made vast fortunes for those profiting from the slave trade and brought unimaginable misery to countless millions of people across generations. Money doesn't get much dirtier than that. For a less disreputable way to profit from someone else's losses, how about a bit of insurance fraud? This ethically dubious means of playing the system seems to have been deployed by Jeremiah Hamilton, a man so shadowy that we don't even have a picture of him, or possibly even his real name. The elusive Mr. Hamilton first shows up in historical records in the late 1820s, running a counterfeit coin scam in his native Haiti. From here, it was a short step to insurance fraud. He would over-insure worm-eaten vessels and then sink them, guaranteeing him a big insurance payout. With that money, he bought land in and around New York and headed for the big time. Hamilton could now turn to an honest living, running an early kind of hedge fund. By taking a small commission on the huge amounts of money flowing through his highly successful fund, he rapidly became Wall Street's first black millionaire. And on his death, was considered the richest black man in America. Profiteering from war is another way to make money out of human misery. Ask Basil Zaharoff. The 20th century saw war on an unprecedented scale, and this made Basil very happy. Basil had many skills. He'd allegedly tried embezzling, pimping, arson, and theft, not to mention bigamy, before realizing he could use all these skills far more lucratively in the arms trade. Never one to worry overly about who was getting his wares, Zaharoff would happily set up deals to sell weapons to both sides in a conflict. This morally bankrupt technique is still remembered as the Système Zaharoff, and it made him £195,000 in commissions between 1902 and 1905. That's just under £25 million in modern terms. But it was the First World War that really made his fortune. Zaharoff brokered deals to sell weapons to the Allies that earned him a commission of over $1.2 billion. By the end of his life, he was considered an international man of mystery, an agent of death, and possibly the inspiration for James Bond's nemesis, Ernst Stavro Blofeld.
His job for 50 years has been to foment wars and supply all nations with weapons of destruction. He began life a poor Greek. He is ending it one of the richest men in the world.
Of course, while Zaharoff was involved in mass violence in an indirect way, there are others who prefer a more hands-on approach. Throughout history, the search for riches beyond your wildest dreams has launched many an adventurer on their way. And the discovery that those riches already belong to someone else has proved as good a motivation as any for war and conquest. In the 16th century, Spanish adventurers known as the conquistadors were busy killing and conquering their way towards the vast quantities of gold and silver the Americas had to offer. In 1533, Francisco Pizarro accepted a ransom of a 377-square-foot room filled with gold and silver to spare a captive Incan prince, Atahualpa. Not a man of his word, he had Atahualpa strangled anyway. In the mid-18th century, Britain's Honourable East India Company was doing its best to take over India with its own private army. When the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, sided with French merchants against the company's man in India, Robert Clive, didn't just sit back and call the lawyers. He planned a coup. In October 1756, he marched with 3,000 troops on the Nawab's capital and promptly deposed him, installing a friendlier face on the throne. So friendly that the new Nawab paid Clive and his fellow company directors over £250,000 each as a bonus. Do you really want to make your fortune at the expense of your reputation and perhaps even your soul? Sadly, history suggests people are all too eager to answer that question with a resounding yes. But wouldn't it be much nicer just to find your fortune by chance? Some people are just lucky, in the right place at the right time to stumble upon a fortune, even a small one. And it doesn't need to be a diamond. A grimy old tooth will do. Provided it belonged to a beetle, that is. When John Lennon went to the dentist to have a molar extracted, he gave it to his housekeeper, Dorothy Jarlett. Lovely. Her family sold it on to British music mogul Alan McGee, who auctioned it in 2011 for $31,000. Bought by a Canadian dentist. The tooth fairy's rates have certainly gone up. While we're on the subject of old teeth, at the beginning of the 19th century, there was a worldwide tooth shortage. Richer diets meant bad teeth, and bad teeth meant dentures. But where to get the teeth from? In Britain, the wealthy preferred healthy teeth from young, executed criminals. But there were not enough executed felons to meet the demand for dentures. As luck would have it, Napoleon came to the rescue. After the Battle of Waterloo, body snatchers made a fortune chiseling teeth from the jaws of the dead, packing them into barrels and shipping them to Britain to fill the teeth shortage. To wear dentures was to sport a Waterloo smile. A smile you could be proud of, even if some of the teeth were enemy molars. Incidentally, George Washington's famous set of gnashers were made from hippo ivory. Some people have gone to extraordinary lengths to turn a quick buck off old body parts. Argentinian dictator and kleptocrat Juan Perón was ransomed in 1986, 12 years after his death. Thieves drilled into his coffin and cut off his hands with a chainsaw, for which they demanded $8 million. None of Perón's old friends coughed up what would have been the equivalent of 20 million today. And the dictator's hands have never been found. They say one man's trash is another man's treasure, and if you're savvy enough to know the difference, perhaps you could simply find your fortune in the local flea market. In 1989, a Philadelphia man spent $4 on a picture frame. When he discarded the old picture in the frame, he found an original copy of the US Declaration of Independence folded up inside, one of only 200 that were made in 1776.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights.
He sold it at Sotheby's in 1991 for $2.4 million, which he probably thought was a good return, until new owners resold it 9 years later for $8.1 million. But if you can't stumble upon a fortune, perhaps you could win it. One way to get rich by getting lucky is to pick random numbers on a piece of paper. The lottery, the most widely accepted form of gambling. It started in China more than 2,000 years ago. They used it to fund public projects, much like today, including, it is believed, the Great Wall of China. And of course, the odds are very much stacked against you. But if you do win, you could be as lucky as one chap from South Carolina, who in 2018 won a staggering $1.537 billion. The biggest lottery win in all history. But be careful. Unexpected wealth can come as a shock to the system.
So when people suddenly get huge amounts of wealth, right, well, it will disrupt their lives in profound ways. When we look at lottery winners, for example, we find that most lottery winners actually say years later that they wish they hadn't won, right? That their life was so distorted by this acquisition of enormous wealth that they were less happy afterwards than they were before.
And while we're in the market for something for nothing, few schemes can match the here today, gone tomorrow investment crazes. Known as bubbles, and one of history's most unlikely bubbles, inflated almost 400 years ago, in the Netherlands. Everybody loves something rare, and in the mid-1600s, the Dutch, enjoying a period of unmatched wealth and prosperity, found delight in broken tulips. Bulbs that produced striped and speckled flowers. Investors moved in, and between December 1636 and February 1637, prices spiked, with the most prized bulbs, especially the rarest Semper Augustus, experiencing a 12-fold price jump, making each one worth the price of a swanky house in the best part of town. The people buying these bulbs weren't planning to put flowers in vases, of course. They were speculators, buying in the hope their value would keep on rising. But what goes up eventually comes crashing down. In 1637, confidence in the market suddenly collapsed. Traders no longer believed prices would keep going up, which meant, in an instant, they plummeted, as that belief had been the only thing that had made the tulip bulbs worth so much. The bubble had burst.
When you think about the tulip craze in Amsterdam, that was all about perceived rarity. All of a sudden, the perceived value of those tulips began to change. And all of those people who had spent money, it was gone. They were wiped out.
But if you do have an appetite for risk and the steely nerve to back your hunches, you can make a fortune in the markets. Like this woman, Hetty Green, derisively known as the Witch of Wall Street. She was one of the only female financiers in America during the mid-19th century. Building a stock and property portfolio with her father, she inherited $10 million on his death and took to contrarian investing. When others sold, Hetty bought, and when they bought, she sold. At her death in 1916, Hetty was probably the richest woman in the world, leaving an estate of $100 million, just over $2.5 billion today. Yet despite this staggering wealth, Hetty was not a spender. She dressed almost entirely in black, wearing only one dress every day until it wore out. She refused to use heating or hot water, and she lived with her children in inexpensive housing in Brooklyn Heights. Whenever illness struck, Hetty looked for a free clinic to get treatment or ignored the pain till it got worse. One famous story suggests that she refused to let a doctor treat her son's injured leg, so it had to be amputated. Which just goes to show, if you make a fortune, you need a plan for what you're going to do with it. After all, money doesn't spend itself. So, you've made your fortune, you've inherited, or you've worked for it, or it's just fallen into your lap. But what to do with it now that you've got it? It's time to splash the cash. And no one ever splashed as much cash as Musa I of Mali, who was very likely the richest man ever to have lived. And in 1324, the world was about to find out just how rich when he set off on a pilgrimage to Mecca. Not one for budget travel. Chronicles describe Musa's entourage of tens of thousands of people, 500 heralds bearing gold staffs and dressed in fine silks, and scores of camels and horses carrying lots and lots of gold. So much gold, in fact, that his generous tipping and wild spending in places like Cairo caused rampant inflation and depressed the economies he traveled through for a generation. By the time he returned to Mali, his fame had spread so far that he made it onto the most important world map of medieval Europe, the Catalan Atlas, the 1375 equivalent of being Time magazine's Person of the Year. Of course, you can spend your fabulous wealth on a lot of fabulous stuff. When William Randolph Hearst finally took full control of the family fortune in 1919, he went on the mother of all spending sprees, snapping up priceless art, sculptures, and ancient treasures from around the globe. Needing somewhere to keep his new collection, Hearst headed to his California ranch and instructed his architect to build him something a little bit more comfortable up on the hill. The result was Hearst Castle, a 58-bedroom monument to opulence which took 28 years to complete. With gardens spanning 127 acres, Hearst's personal playground offered every comfort, including 60 bathrooms, should any guest be caught a little short after imbibing too much of the free-flowing champagne. Hearst isn't the only rich character to lavish his wealth on an exotic collection. In 2004, billionaire hedge fund manager Steve Cohen bought a 14-foot tiger shark. Not a live one, but one that had been turned into art and preserved in a tank of alcohol and formaldehyde by artist Damien Hirst. Called The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living, Cohen's said to have paid between $8 and $12 million for it. All very impressive, but remember, you can't take it with you. At least, not anymore. And even if you fill your tomb with fabulous treasure, eventually someone will break in and get their hands on it. And as Jesus said, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. But what if you could use your money to ease those pearly gates open? In medieval Europe, Christians faced a long stretch in purgatory when they died, where they suffered for their past sins before they could go to heaven. That didn't sound like much fun, so the church offered indulgences, time off from these unpleasant ordeals in return for good deeds. But by the 15th century, the Catholic Church had started accepting hard cash instead of good deeds. So, no matter how sin filled their lives, very rich people were able to buy themselves a total remission of their sins, effectively a get-out-of-purgatory-free card. So while indulgences are generally less available from the Catholic Church, you can still use your money to improve your posthumous reputation by putting it to work for the public good.
Personalities of the day. John D. Rockefeller enjoying his 94th year with 3 holes of golf per outing. He left business and his multi-million-dollar philanthropies to younger hands.
John D. Rockefeller, in his lifetime, was a hated monopolist, probably one of the most hated people in America. We remember him as the founder of the Rockefeller Trust, whose philanthropies changed the world.
During the mid-20th century, the Rockefeller Trust combated malaria in Italy and developed a vaccine for yellow fever. It also funded a public health project in 11 southern states to treat hookworm disease, which affected 40% of the population.
So if John D. Rockefeller laundered his reputation with charitable donations, if that's what we got from it, I'm okay with that outcome.
Steel magnate Andrew Carnegie also had some work to do towards the end of his life if he wanted a nice obituary.
Andrew Carnegie used violence repeatedly to break unions at his steel mills, right? He was, by any normal standard, a business person who we would find horrific. We remember him as the person who built libraries all across the United States. So the last impulse to philanthropy might not be an altruistic one, but a selfish one. Having bought everything else, I would also like to buy legacy and reputation.
But at least Carnegie had a plan. Spend the first third of your life getting all the education one can, spend the next third making all the money you can, spend the last third giving it away.
Moved. Millions.
But whatever your plans for your fortune, there's a good chance people will end up fighting over it when you're gone. In the early 20th century, Osman Ali Khan, the last Nizam of Hyderabad, was reportedly worth more than $100 million in gold and silver bullion and $400 million in jewelry. When he found the Jacob diamond, 185 carats and worth $200 million, in the toe of his late father's shoe, he went on to use it as a paperweight. It's reported that he was so rich he had enough pearls to cover Piccadilly Circus. It was also reported that the Nizam had more than 80 mistresses and at least 100 grandchildren. And this would be the undoing of his dynasty after his death in 1967. Since then, his descendants have been locked in endless legal battles over who gets a share of his dwindling fortune, now around $40 million held in a London bank. And declining fortunes brings us back to William Randolph Hearst. His yellow journalism and political manoeuvring won the circulation wars. But by 1937, the Hearst Corporation was known to be $35 million in debt. And some reports suggest it was actually more like $125 million. Hearst couldn't pay his debts, so he lost control of his company, was forced to take a humiliating pay cut, and had to sell off 20,000 items from his art collection and furniture in New York's Gimbel's department store. The sale included pulpits, precious stained glass, armor, fire screens, George Washington's waistcoat, Thomas Jefferson's Bible, and Charles Dickens's sideboard. But at least Hearst wasn't forgotten. In 1941, he inspired the lead character in the movie Citizen Kane, the debut feature from star and director Orson Welles. It was a rather unflattering portrait of a newspaper mogul who dabbled in politics and liked showgirls, and Hearst was enraged. He used all the media power at his disposal to try to suppress the film. He banned all mention of it from his papers, petitioned the studio to burn the negative, and even planned to compromise Orson Welles with a 14-year-old girl in a hotel bedroom. But while his campaign killed the film's box office, even Hearst couldn't beat history, and Citizen Kane is now often cited as the greatest film of all time. So, what have we learnt? The easiest way to get a fortune is to inherit one. Unless you can strike it lucky. Failing that, hard work, ruthlessness, and a bit of dodgy dealing can do the trick. But whether you hoard it, spend it on dead sharks, or just give it all away, one way or another, that fortune will eventually slip from your hands, and all you'll have left is your reputation. The biggest lesson about making a fortune? It's up to you to find a way to leave a legacy to be proud of. So be careful how you spend it.